There is a particular kind of silence that precedes a catastrophe, a heavy, perfumed stillness that settles over a room like a shroud. Imagine, if you will, the sound of a single rose petal hitting a marble floor. It is a sound so faint, it is almost an idea rather than a physical reality. Now, imagine that sound multiplied by millions. Imagine a soft, rhythmic hissing, like the breath of a dying god, as the ceiling above you begins to groan under the weight of a floral ocean. At first, the guests at the banquet of the Emperor Elagabalus laughed. They reached out their wine-stained hands to catch the fluttering flakes of pink, white, and deep crimson. They draped them over their ears and inhaled the intoxicating scent of 1,000 summer gardens. It was the ultimate display of Roman decadence, a gesture of such absurd beauty that it felt like a dream. But the petals did not stop. They fell faster, thicker, turning the air into a dense floral fog. The laughter turned into confusion, then into a muffled, frantic struggle. The sheer weight of the beauty began to crush the life out of the room. This was not just a dinner party, it was a performance of absolute power, where the line between a gift and a death sentence was as thin as a petal's edge. To understand how the world arrived at this moment of suffocating elegance, we must look away from the marble halls of Rome and toward the scorching horizons of the East. The year was 218 AD, and the Roman Empire was a bruised and volatile beast. The Severan dynasty had brought a rough, soldierly stability to the realm, but the assassination of the Emperor Caracalla had left a vacuum that nature and political ambition abhorred. Into this void stepped a family of Syrian women who possessed a terrifying degree of intelligence and a total lack of sentimentality. At the head of this clan was Julia Maesa, the sister-in-law of the late Septimius Severus. She was a woman who understood that in Rome, the mask of legitimacy was more important than the truth. When the usurper Macrinus took the throne, Maesa did not flee into obscurity. Instead, she retreated to her ancestral home in Emesa, a city that smelled of spices and ancient stone, where her grandson served as the high priest of a strange and powerful deity. This grandson was Varius Avitus Bassianus, a boy of barely 14 years old, known to history as El-Gabalus. He was not a creature of the Roman Forum or the military camp. He was a creature of the temple. He was the hereditary high priest of the sun god El-Gabal, a deity represented not by a human statue, but by a massive conical black stone that had supposedly fallen from the heavens. The boy was strikingly beautiful, with soft features and eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. He spent his days draped in silks and gold, dancing around the black stone to the hypnotic beat of drums and the wailing of flutes. To the Roman soldiers stationed in the east, he was an exotic curiosity, but to Julia Maesa, he was a weapon. She spread the rumor that the boy was the secret illegitimate son of Caracalla, playing on the soldiers' lingering loyalty to the old dynasty. She bought the legions with gold and promises, and soon the boy priest was declared emperor. The march from Syria to Rome was less a military procession and more a psychedelic parade. Elagabalus did not travel as a Roman general clad in iron and leather. He traveled as a god. He wore tunics of pure silk, a material so expensive it was literally worth its weight in gold, and adorned himself with pearls that hung from his ears and wrists like frozen tears. His face was painted with white lead and vermilion, his eyelids darkened with kohl. This was the first great shock to the Roman psyche. The Romans valued gravitas, a heavy, somber dignity. They expected their emperors to be rugged, stoic, and traditionally masculine. What they received instead was a shimmering, androgynous teenager who seemed to find the very idea of Roman tradition hilarious. He brought with him the black stone of Emesa, mounted on a chariot encrusted with jewels and pulled by 6 white horses. He refused to walk in the dust. Instead, he walked backwards in front of the stone, never taking his eyes off his god, while servants spread gold dust on the path before him. When he finally arrived in Rome, the Senate looked on in a state of paralysis. They saw a boy who looked more like a Persian bride than a Roman Caesar. He immediately subverted the religious hierarchy of the city, placing his sun god above Jupiter, the father of the Roman pantheon. This was not just a religious shift, it was a systematic dismantling of the Roman identity. He built a magnificent temple on the Palatine Hill, the El-Gabalium, and demanded that the most sacred relics of Rome, the fire of the Vestal Virgins, the shields of the Sully, the Palatine itself, be moved there to serve his black stone. He was a whirlwind of sacrilege, yet he held the purple robes of the emperor, and for a time, the sheer audacity of his presence kept the daggers at bay. He was a boy who lived in a world of pure sensation, a world where the constraints of the past did not exist, and where every whim, no matter how perverse or expensive, had to be realized instantly. The young emperor's court became a theater of the bizarre. He was fascinated by the idea of roles and reversals. He would often dress as a female tavern keeper, wearing a wig and soliciting patrons in the darker corners of the palace. He appointed men to high office not based on their administrative skills, but on the size of their physical attributes. A dancer became the prefect of the guards, a barber became the overseer of the grain supply. To Elagabalus, the Roman Empire was not a political entity to be managed, it was a massive, glittering toy. He would host lotteries where the prizes ranged from a box of dead flies to 10 pounds of gold, or from a eunuch to a dead dog. He loved the unpredictability of it, the way fortune could elevate the low and crush the high in a single moment. It was this love of the unpredictable, this desire to push every experience to its breaking point, that led him to the idea of the banquets. The dining rooms of the Palatine were already legendary for their excess, but Elagabalus found them dull. He wanted to dine on the impossible. He served his guests peas mixed with gold pieces, lentils mixed with precious gems, and rice mixed with pearls. He would present his guests with glass food that looked real, or wooden meat that was painted so perfectly it fooled the eye, watching with delight as they broke their teeth trying to eat. He was obsessed with the ephemeral, things that existed only for a moment before they vanished. He was a child playing with the wealth of the known world, and his games were beginning to take on a darker, more claustrophobic hue. As the first year of his reign bled into the second, the tension in Rome reached a fever pitch. The boy who would be a god was also a boy who was losing his grip on the reality of the people he ruled. He didn't care for the grain doles or the frontier wars. He cared for the texture of a silk ribbon and the specific shade of a rose's petal. He began to plan a series of grand entertainments that would secure his legacy, not as a conqueror, but as an artist of the extreme. He wanted to create a moment that was so beautiful it would become lethal, a paradox of grace and horror. The whispers in the palace corridors spoke of a new kind of feast, where the architecture itself would participate in the revelry. The guest list was carefully chosen: senators who had offended him, rivals who feared him, and the curious who simply wanted to see the Sun King in his glory. They arrived at the banquet hall, assowed unaware that the ceiling above them was a false one, a trapdoor to a floral heaven that was destined to become a tomb. They sat on their silken couches, drinking wine cooled with snow from the mountains, while the young emperor watched them from his high dais, his eyes shimmering with a secret, terrifying joy. The flutes began to play, a low melodic drone that filled the space, and for a moment, everything was perfect. The air was cool, the wine was sweet, and the first pink petal drifted down from the shadows of the rafters. It was the beginning of the end of the Roman summer, a descent into a soft, suffocating madness that would leave the world gasping for air.
The second petal followed the first, a silent twin of crimson dancing through the column of light that hit the center of the hall. Then came a third, a fourth, and within seconds, a gentle flurry of pink and white began to descend upon the reclining guests. Senator Aurelius, a man whose skin was as weathered as the stones of the Appian Way, caught one in his wine cup. He laughed, a deep, gravelly sound that echoed against the vaulted ceiling. To him, this was merely another of the emperor's eccentricities, a lavish display of wealth meant to impress and perhaps intimidate. He signaled to the slave standing behind his couch to pour more of the Falernian wine, oblivious to the fact that the slave's hands were trembling. The slave knew what the senator did not, that the ceiling above them was not a solid structure of stone and mortar, but a complex series of reversible panels, held in place by a web of silk ropes and the desperate strength of 100 men hidden in the darkness of the attic. Above them, the young emperor sat motionless. His face was a mask of painted perfection, his eyes outlined in kohl, his lips stained with the juice of crushed berries. He wore a crown of gold that mimicked the rays of the sun, a nod to his heritage as the high priest of El-Gabal. To the Roman elite, he was an enigma, a foreign boy-king who spoke of strange gods and practiced even stranger rituals. They tolerated him because they had to, because the legions supported him, and because the memory of the Severan dynasty still held some weight. But tonight, El-Gabal was not interested in politics or the fragile peace of the empire. He was interested in the sublime. He watched as the trickle of petals turned into a steady stream, a floral waterfall that began to obscure the faces of the men he loomed over. The scent was the first thing to change. What had begun as a delicate fragrance, a hint of spring in the heart of the city, rapidly became something more aggressive. The air in the banquet hall was thick and warm, and as the petals accumulated, they released a cloying, heavy perfume that seemed to coat the back of the throat. It was the scent of 1,000 gardens condensed into a single room, a scent so sweet it bordered on the nauseating. The guests began to cough, their laughter dying away as they realized the rain was not stopping. The flutes continued their drone, but the melody had shifted into something more dissonant, a jarring accompaniment to the rustle of falling flowers. "Is this not a gift?" El-Gabal finally spoke, his voice high and clear, cutting through the low hum of the room. "Is there any end to the bounty of the sun? We provide you with the very essence of life, the beauty that the earth yields only to those it loves." He gestured with ringed hand, and on that signal, the hidden slaves above pulled the main release levers. The sound was like a sharp intake of breath, the collective groan of wood and rope giving way. Suddenly, the sky fell. It was no longer a trickle or a stream, it was an avalanche of color. Tons of rose petals gathered from the vast estates of the east and transported at great expense across the Mediterranean, cascaded down upon the diners. They hit the tables with a soft, muffled thud, extinguishing the oil lamps and plunging the lower half of the room into a chaotic, fragrant twilight. The senators scrambled to their feet, their silken robes heavy with the weight of the flowers. Senator Aurelius tried to stand, but his feet slipped on the carpet of crushed blossoms. He reached out to steady himself on the table, but the table itself was disappearing beneath the floral tide. The petals were everywhere, in their hair, in their eyes, filling their mouths when they tried to speak. There was a sudden, sharp realization that this was not a performance. It was a siege. The beauty was a weapon, and the flowers were the soldiers. The exits, which had been standing wide only moments ago, were now being quietly shuttered. Massive bronze doors, decorated with scenes of pastoral peace, swung shut with a finality that echoed like a hammer on an anvil. The guards outside dropped heavy iron bars into place, ensuring that no one would leave until the emperor willed it. Inside, the panic began to take hold. It was a strange, muted kind of panic, for the roses muffled the sound of their cries. A man could be screaming for help only a few feet away, and his voice would reach his neighbor as nothing more than a faint, distorted whisper. El-Gabal watched with a detached curiosity. To him, the struggling figures below looked like insects caught in a jar of honey. He wondered how long it would take for the air to run out, or if the sheer weight of the beauty would be the thing that broke them first. He reached down and picked up a single petal that had landed on his knee, rolling it between his thumb and forefinger until it bruised and bled its essence. He was a god, he told himself, and gods did not concern themselves with the struggles of mortals. He was merely providing them with a more beautiful end than they deserved. The pile of petals was now waist-deep in the center of the hall. The guests were no longer trying to save their wine or their dignity. They were fighting for air. They waded through the drifts of roses like men drowning in a sea of velvet. Every movement only served to agitate the flowers more, releasing fresh clouds of pollen and dust that made breathing nearly impossible. The heat in the room was rising, trapped by the layers of organic material that now covered every surface. It was a humid, floral furnace, and the sweet smell of the roses began to take on a darker note, the smell of decay, of life being crushed out of existence. One young man, a nephew of a prominent general, managed to claw his way to the base of the emperor's dais. He looked up, his eyes wide with terror, his mouth agape as he gasped for breath. He reached out a hand, a silent plea for mercy, but the emperor only smiled. It was a smile of genuine warmth, the smile of a child who has finally found a way to make his toys behave. El-Gabal leaned forward, his golden robes shimmering in the torchlight, and whispered words that only the dying boy could hear. "Why do you struggle against the light?" he asked, his voice melodic and soft. "This is the most beautiful moment of your life. Accept it. Become part of the garden. Be at peace, little bird," the young Sun King quietly murmured, his eyes reflecting the dying orange glow of the flickering torches. The boy's hand sank back into the roses as a fresh wave of petals fell from above, burying him completely. The room was becoming a landscape of soft mounds and shifting dunes. The architecture of the hall was being swallowed by the relentless tide of pink and red.
The mounds of velvet continued to rise, a silent, fragrant tide that transformed the opulent triclinium into a landscape of surreal, undulating hills. The boy was gone, his final struggle a mere ripple in the deepening sea of flora, but the emperor's gaze remained fixed on the spot for a moment longer, as if waiting for a flower to bloom from the boy's very chest. Above, the mechanism of the ceiling groaned, a low, rhythmic sound of pulleys and wooden gears that seemed entirely out of place amidst the ethereal beauty of the falling blossoms. It was the sound of the mundane laboring to produce the divine. To El-Gabalus, the sound was a heartbeat, the mechanical pulse of an empire he intended to remake in the image of his own fevered dreams. He turned his attention back to the wider room, where the panic of his guests had shifted from frantic movement to a heavy, sluggish desperation. The petals were no longer a nuisance or a novelty, they were a weight. A guest near the center of the hall, a senator whose name had been forgotten even by those who once feared him, attempted to stand upon a low table, but the silk-draped wood offered no purchase. He slipped, his sandals sliding against the bruised petals, and he vanished beneath the surface with a muffled cry that sounded more like a sigh. The logistics of this floral inundation were in themselves a testament to the absolute power of the Roman administrative machine, even when directed by the whims of a teenager. History often forgets the staggering effort required to facilitate such a spectacle. These were not merely local wildflowers gathered from the Roman countryside. To achieve the sheer volume required to fill a hall of this magnitude, the emperor's agents had spent months coordinating with the governors of Egypt and Africa Proconsularis. Thousands of crates of Rosa Gallica and Rosa Damascena had been transported across the Mediterranean in the holds of grain ships, kept alive in damp clay or preserved in vats of honeyed water to maintain their suppleness. The cost in sestertii would have funded a legion for a year, yet here they were, falling like colorful snow to serve as the instruments of a beautiful, terrifying end. The fragrance, initially a delight, had become an atmospheric poison. The sheer concentration of floral oils and pollen began to irritate the lungs of the guests. The air was thick, cloying, and increasingly devoid of the oxygen necessary to sustain the frantic energy of the revelers. As the tide reached the waists of those standing, the social hierarchy of Rome began to dissolve. Senators, once defined by the purple stripes of their tunics, were now indistinguishable from the freedmen and sycophants who surrounded them. They all shared the same desperate swimming motions, trying to keep their heads above the shifting pink dunes. The architecture itself seemed to be retreating. The Corinthian columns, carved from expensive Phrygian marble, were being swallowed inch by inch, their intricate acanthus leaf capitals soon to be the only things visible above the floral sea. The torches, mounted high on the walls, cast long, flickering shadows that danced across the surface of the petals, making the room feel like it was breathing. Every few seconds, another gust of petals would burst from the ceiling, released by the hidden slaves who toiled in the darkness of the rafters. These slaves, unlike the guests, were witnesses to the entire unfolding tragedy, yet they remained silent, their hands moving with the precision of clockwork, obedient to the will of their sun-king. El-Gabalus watched this dissolution with a detached, artistic curiosity. He was no longer just an emperor, he was a creator witnessing the birth of a new world. To him, the struggling men and women below were not human beings, but elements of a composition. He reached out and caught a single white petal, turning it over in his delicate, ringed fingers. "Look how they fight the inevitable," he whispered to a nearby servant, though his voice was mostly lost to the rustle of the falling flowers. "They do not understand that to be buried in beauty is the greatest mercy a god can grant. In the temples of Emesa, we taught that the sun consumes everything it loves. Why should I be any different?" His Syrian heritage, so often a point of contention and mockery among the Roman elite, was the very lens through which he viewed this execution. He was the high priest of El-Gabal, and this banquet was his grandest sacrifice. The Roman pragmatism of his predecessors, the stoicism of Marcus Aurelius, or the military grit of Septimius Severus, had no place in this hall. Here there was only the absolute, blinding light of the east, filtered through a rain of roses. The physical sensation for those trapped below was becoming agonizing. The weight of the petals was deceptive, individually light but collectively crushing. It was a soft, suffocating pressure that restricted the expansion of the chest. Some guests had tried to burrow toward the exits, but the doors had been barred from the outside by the Praetorian Guard, who stood like iron statues, their faces impassive beneath their plumed helmets. The sound of the room had changed too. The sharp clatter of silver plates and the tinkling of glassware had been replaced by a heavy, dampened silence. It was the sound of a forest floor, deep and insulating. When someone screamed, the sound traveled only a few feet before being absorbed by the velvet layers. It was a lonely way to die, surrounded by hundreds of people yet isolated in a private floral tomb. The pollen was now a visible haze in the air, catching the torchlight and creating a golden aura around the emperor's dais. It looked as though he were floating on a cloud of amber. One woman, a cousin of the imperial family who had once boasted of her influence at court, found herself pinned against a marble statue of Apollo. The god's stone face seemed to mock her as the petals reached her chin. She tilted her head back, gasping for a final draft of clean air, but all she inhaled was the intoxicating, dusty scent of the damasks. Her eyes met El-Gabalus for a fleeting second. In that look, there was no plea for mercy, only a profound, dazed confusion. How had the world come to this? How had the center of civilization become a playground for a boy god who valued a flower more than a life? The emperor did not blink. He merely watched as the next wave of petals, a deep crimson this time, cascaded over her, erasing her from the visual field as if she had never existed. The statue of Apollo followed soon after, the stone god disappearing into the red waves, leaving only the emperor as the sole figure of authority in the room. The banquet tables were now entirely submerged. The fine wines of Campania and the exotic delicacies from the ends of the empire were lost, buried beneath the floral wealth. It was a profound irony that in a city often plagued by hunger, the greatest waste in history was occurring not with food but with flowers. The sheer decadence of it was meant to be the point. El-Gabalus was making a statement about the transience of power and the permanence of beauty. He was the sun, and the sun did not concern itself with the cost of its rays. He began to hum a low, melodic tune, a hymn from his youth in Syria, his voice rising slightly to compete with the rhythmic clacking of the ceiling gears. The room was nearly 3/4 full. The mounds had leveled out into a vast rolling plain of pink, red, and white. The few remaining guests were no longer struggling. They were merely bobbing, their heads tilted back, their eyes wide and glassy as they succumbed to the floral embrace. The end was near, but for El-Gabalus, the masterpiece was only just reaching its most exquisite movement. He stood up from his throne, his golden robes trailing behind him like a river of light, and stepped toward the edge of the dais, looking down at the silent, beautiful sea he had created.
The ceiling gave one final violent shudder, and the largest mass of petals yet began to descend.
The final release was not a shower, but a deluge, a heavy, suffocating weight of flora that possessed the density of water. This last mass of petals did not drift, it collapsed, a pink and white avalanche that buried the remaining clearings of the floor in an instant. The soft collective whoosh of the air being displaced by the falling blooms was the last sound many of the guests would ever hear. It was a sensory paradox, the softest material imaginable becoming a lethal instrument through sheer, unbridled volume. As the petals settled, they pressed against the chests of the fallen, filling their mouths and nostrils with the cloying, sweet scent of 1,000 summers. The silence that followed was absolute, a heavy velvet shroud that draped itself over the room, broken only by the faint, distant crackle of a guttering torch. El-Gabal remained on the edge of the dais, his eyes fixed on the undulating surface of the Rose Sea. To him, the scene was not one of carnage, but of ultimate aesthetic achievement. The guests, once rowdy and demanding, were now part of a static masterpiece. He saw a hand, draped in heavy rings, clutching at the air before slowly sinking beneath the surface like a drowning sailor. He saw the tip of a senator's laurel wreath bobbing for a moment on a crust of crimson before it too was claimed by the tide. The emperor reached down and plucked a single, unbruised petal from the air as it made its final, lazy journey to the ground. He rolled it between his thumb and forefinger, feeling the cool, waxy texture. In his mind, he had achieved the impossible. He had frozen time and turned the messy, chaotic business of Roman politics into a still life. He took a step forward, his golden sandals sinking deep into the floral drift. The petals swirled around his ankle, soft and yielding, a stark contrast to the cold marble below. In the cold light of historical analysis, the Rose Petal Banquet occupies a strange space between documented fact and hyperbolic propaganda. Most of what we know of this event comes from Historia Augusta, a collection of biographies that is notoriously unreliable, often blending genuine history with the ancient equivalent of tabloid gossip. The chronicler, Aelius Lampridius, wrote with the specific intent of painting Elagabalus as the ultimate bad emperor, a figure of such decadence and depravity that his eventual assassination would seem not just justified, but necessary. Critics argue that the logistics of such an event, the sheer volume of petals required, the engineering of the ceiling, suggested that the story may have been an exaggeration of a particularly extravagant but non-lethal party. Yet, even if the death toll was a fabrication, the symbolism remains potent. It represents a tipping point in the Roman consciousness, a moment where the dignity of the office was utterly subsumed by the whims of a boy priest from the East. To understand why the Rose Petal Banquet so horrified the Roman elite, one must understand the culture clash at the heart of the reign of Elagabalus. He was not just an emperor, he was the high priest of El-Gabal, the sun god of Emesa. He brought with him customs that the Stoic Romans found effeminate and foreign. He wore silks instead of wool, painted his eyes with kohl, and prioritized the ecstatic rituals of his god over the administrative duties of the state. The banquet was the ultimate expression of the Syrian influence, a celebration of luxury and sensory overload that spat in the face of the traditional Roman virtues of gravitas and frugalitas. The guests buried beneath the roses were more than just victims of a prank. They were the physical embodiment of the old Rome being smothered by the new. The scent of the roses was to the Romans the scent of their own irrelevance. The fallout from such excesses was inevitable. The grandmother of Elagabalus, the formidable Julia Maesa, realized that her grandson's behavior was threatening the very survival of their dynasty. She began to pivot her support toward her cousin, Alexander Severus, a boy who promised to return to traditional Roman values. The Praetorian Guard, whose loyalty was always bought and never truly earned, grew increasingly resentful of the eccentricities of the emperor and his perceived disrespect for the military. The Rose Petal Banquet, whether it ended in literal suffocation or merely profound embarrassment, served as a catalyst for the simmering discontent. It was the moment the mask of divine kingship slipped, revealing a vulnerable, perhaps even delusional teenager who understood the language of flowers but not the language of power. The end came in March of 222 AD. The Praetorian Guard, spurred by the machinations of Maesa and their own disgust, cornered Elagabalus and his mother, Julia Soaemias, in the latrines of the Praetorian camp. There was no poetry in his death, no floral drifts or golden light. The boy emperor was butchered, his body dragged through the streets of Rome and eventually tossed into the Tiber like common refuse. The Senate issued a damnatio memoriae, attempting to erase his name from history, to scrub the records of his reign and pretend that the 4 years of his rule had been nothing more than a fever dream. But history, much like the scent of a crushed rose, is difficult to fully wash away. It lingers in the cracks of the stone. For those of us watching from the distance of 18 centuries, the Rose Petal Banquet serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power when wielded by those who see the world only as a stage for their own amusement. It is a story about the fragility of beauty and the hardness of reality. The boring history of Elagabalus is not found in the scandalous tales of his banquets, but in the slow, grinding machinery of imperial decline. It is found in the debasement of the currency, the shifting loyalties of the legions, and the desperate attempts of a grandmother to maintain a grip on a world that was rapidly changing.
The roses were a distraction, a vibrant, perfumed curtain draped over the crumbling foundations of an empire. They were the decorative mask of a system that was beginning to fail. As we close the doors on the triclinium of El-Gabalus, we are left with the image of the petals. They would have eventually wilted, their vibrant colors fading to a dull, bruised brown. The servants would have been called in to shovel away the remains of the feast, clearing the room for the next day's business. The scent would have lingered for weeks, a ghost of a night that defied logic. We often look for deep meaning in the past, but perhaps the Rose Petal Banquet was